Hello! This is again a video both for my students in my class and for anyone who's interested in watching. Today I'm going to be talking about Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own. If you've been in my class, you've had a selection you're required to read, but for the rest of you, I'll read some selections and talk a little bit about the background. So one thing that's not mentioned in the reader for this course is that this is a short book of hers, but it was originally a lecture. She was asked to write about women in fiction. She gives this description of the experience of figuring out what she was going to say about women in fiction. But, you may say, we asked you to speak about women in fiction. What has that got to do with A Room of One's Own? And then she goes on to say, she thought about the different ways in which she could write about women in fiction and which women she could write about and what sort of fiction and how these two are tied together. And you might have meant it to mean women and what they are like, or it might mean women and the fiction that they write, or it might mean women and the fiction that is written about them, or it might mean somehow all three are inextricably mixed together, and you want me to consider them in that light. But when I began to consider the subject in this way, which seemed the most interesting, I soon saw that it had one fatal drawback. I should never be able to come to a conclusion. I should never be able to fulfill what is, I understand, the first duty of a lecturer, to hand you, after an hour's discourse, a nugget of pure truth to wrap up between the pages of your notebooks and keep on the mantelpiece forever. All I could do was to offer you an opinion upon one minor point. A woman must have money and a room of her own if she is to write fiction. And that, as you will see, leaves the great problem of the true nature of women and the true nature of fiction unsolved. The reason I'm bringing up this opening to the lecture is that these two themes about space and about money and power and how those are connected with what it means to be a woman and what it means to be an academic. So her work is academic work with fiction. She's not only a writer of fiction, but also a critic of fiction. James Joyce, the Bloomsbury group, there's a bunch of them writing at this time in England, which is like early 20th century. And they're doing a lot of really innovative stuff with the way narrative is presented. You'll notice even in this lecture, which is like not exactly fiction, there's a very stream of consciousness style that's going on. This is not nearly as much as in some of her books, like To the Lighthouse or Mrs. Dalloway is like this as well. There are very few paragraph breaks, and like the transitions between different ideas and thoughts are very opaque. She's trying to display the way in which our minds work and how when we write, we tend to organize things and set things up, but when we think, it's all sort of muddled together. But I wanted to point out a couple passages in the reading from the packet that you guys have that connect with these two themes of like the need for a room of one's own and money and power and how those play out. So one of the things I love about this passage that I had you all read was the way in which she's approaching sort of her research question. Just before the passage in question, Virginia Woolf attempts to go to the Oxbridge, which is like a fictional combination of Oxford and Cambridge, the Oxbridge Library, but she's denied access because she is a woman, not allowed to go to the library. So she ends up going to the British Museum's library instead, which again is looking at the ways in which like power and gender are connected, that men are allowed to go to Cambridge as like full scholars, but women are always at this point in time kept outside of those sort of locals of power. And she has this swarm of questions. This is on page 171. Page 171, for those of you following along. For that visit to Oxbridge and the luncheon and the dinner had started a swarm of questions. Why did men drink wine and women water? Why was one sex so prosperous and the other so poor? What effect has poverty on fiction? What conditions are necessary for the creation of art? 1,000 questions at once suggested themselves, but one needed answers, not questions, and an answer was only to be had by consulting the learned and the unprejudiced, who have removed themselves above the strife of tongue and confusion of body, and issued the result of their reasoning and research in books which are to be found in the British Museum. If truth is not found in the shelves of the British Museum, where, I asked myself, picking up a notebook and pencil, is truth? So she does this research, and I love the passage where she's looking at the different categories of subjects about women, on women and poverty, like the condition in Middle Ages of, the habits of the Fiji Islands of, worshipped as a goddess by, etc., and the ways in which she's trying to find these answers to these enormous questions, but finding her texts available to her to be insufficient or frustrating. The other passage I wanted to bring up, in case it hadn't been super obvious, as you were going through, it can be a little hard to follow some of the threads based on this narrative style, was the plot point about her Aunt Mary Beaton, who leaves her a fortune. So this is on page 177. She tells the story of when she gets a legacy from her aunt who has died and left her all this money. She says, "Before that, I had made my living by cadging odd jobs from newspapers, by reporting a donkey show here and a wedding there. I had earned a few pounds by addressing envelopes, reading to old ladies, making artificial flowers, teaching the alphabet to small children in a kindergarten. Such were the chief occupations that were open to women before 1918. I need not, I'm afraid, describe in any detail the hardness of the work, for you know perhaps women who have done it, or the difficulty of living on the money when it was earned, for you may have tried." And she speaks particularly of the way in which having so little money puts you in a position where you're constantly having to deny your own humanity, having to ingratiate yourselves to people who do have money and do have power. Flattery and fawning, not always perhaps necessary, but it seemed necessary, and the stakes were too great to run risks. But she speaks really eloquently of the ways in which, when her aunt dies and leaves her this money, she has the freedom to both pursue her academic work as well as her artistic work. She becomes capable of having, like, money and a room of one's own. And that is what makes her participation as a woman in fiction possible, which I think is really interesting and is a way of using her personal experience to look at the larger claims she's making about gender, about art, and about academia, and who writes books and whose stories get told and all of that. So those are some of the thoughts I had about Virginia Woolf. I hope you enjoyed this reading. For those of you not in my class, if you've read this book and have thoughts you want to share, I'd love to hear them in the comments. And I look forward to reading discussion posts from those of you who I'll see on my site later. All right, take care.